Our interview today with Donnel Stern is part of NYU Postdoc's Oral History Project. The project is intended to honor and preserve the legacy and history of NYU Postdoc through recorded conversations with senior faculty. It's an honor and a pleasure to be sitting here with Donnel Stern and learning a little bit about his early history, the beginnings of his journey into psychoanalysis, his history with Postdoc, and of course his significant contributions to the interpersonal relational field. Welcome, Don.
Thank you.
Although it's a little odd to be welcoming you since you've been gracious enough to welcome us into your home and spend this time with us. I wanted to start by talking about how we came to know each other, which is through the Friday morning study group, which is, from my perspective, a fantastic group.
It is a good group.
It is dynamic, scholarly, serious, but we have a heck of a lot of fun. So I love it. It's like my dessert at the end of the week on Friday mornings. I really look forward to it. But what I wanted to say in regard to that is the study group has been on Zoom. And so we have never met before until this very moment.
In person, yeah.
In person. So it's doubly exciting and meaningful to sit here with you in the flesh.
Ditto.
Okay, great. I wanted to start with your name. Your name has always intrigued me. It's a very distinctive name. And I'm from an Scotch-Irish background. And I'm...
So you must have encountered it before at some point.
I have, in the old sod. But yes, so I'm curious and hopeful that we share a kindred spirit.
Oh, well, we share a kindred spirit whether it comes from there or not. My name is... I was named after both grandfathers. One of them was Jewish, Ashkenazi, Stern. The other was not Scottish, but had a Scottish background. She was a Crawford. So Crawford very officially Scottish, Tartan and all that. It was a long time ago. So my parents were both in this country for several generations before me.
Tartan, do you know which plaid? Are you wearing the plaid?
No. No, the Crawford plaid.
The Crawford plaid. Neat. Well, good. I know that you are not shy about sharing personal history in some of your writing, biographical data about your parents, and early experiences that have been formative.
You're probably thinking of a recent paper on beginning the treatment.
I'm thinking of that paper indeed, beginning the treatment on a personal note. Yeah. Very personal, very poignant, a lot of what you share in there. And I was wondering if you might be willing to recall a little bit a nodal night, as you referred to it, when you had an astonishing experience with a particular person, your junior year of college.
Yeah, it was my junior year of college. It was her freshman year, or sophomore year of college. I think that I said in that paper, and I think it's true that if I hadn't met her, I doubt that I'd be an analyst.
Wow.
Because I certainly didn't have any... I was interested in being of use to people, but the closest I could get was a 12-year-old infatuation with the idea of being a minister, because I grew up going to... When we did go to anything religious, it was a church. It was a Protestant church. We didn't go very much, but when we went, that's what it was. And I saw that the minister, people talked to him, and they said things to him that weren't typical of what they said to other people. That appealed to me, but I didn't want to have to put up with all the rest of it. So I would never have gone that direction. But I did appreciate the way they talked to him, which had a depth and emotional content that I wasn't familiar with elsewhere. So that night, I happened to meet this young woman on the campus that day, and we spent the entire night in her apartment just talking. Nothing more, nothing.
No one said otherwise.
No sexual anything, just talking. And it so happened that my girlfriend at the time, who her best friend lived in the same apartment complex, and I had to sneak out in the morning, looking for all intents and purposes like I'd done what I hadn't, and hoping I wouldn't run into her roommate.
You didn't include that in your paper.
I didn't. But that night was eye-opening for me because we talked about a million different things having to do with our lives. She knew how to do that for some reason, because I say for some reason because I don't think her parents really knew how either. Mine certainly didn't. And it opened something up for me. We ended up going through analytics, going through graduate school eventually, and then through analytic training together, and we broke up at the end of analytic training, but it's still someone who's a friend of mine.
So you're still in touch?
Oh yeah, we have dinner every now and then, and I think we feel quite close to one another, actually. We were children together in a certain way,
So something opened up.
Something opened up, and eventually I was on a track to go into experimental psychology then. I probably would have, but I did, but I quit. I quit after a few months, and that's a different story, a longer story, how eventually we both ended up going into clinical. But that's what happened, and it was a good move for me.
Yeah. So a very powerful experience and a powerful woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm intrigued too what you said about the minister when you were a little younger and seeing people talk to him. And I'm wondering, my guess is you weren't privy to what they were saying. Yeah, he was probably more at a distance?
Yeah, more at a distance, and I just had a sense that he was someone who occupied a position in people's lives that I found appealing in a certain respect, although I would never have wanted to be a minister.
Yeah.
The God part didn't sit that well with me.
But I'm intrigued. My guess, I have a religious background. I can see myself sitting in a pew observing a priest or something. I'm wondering, was there something in the body language or between the person, the supplicant, and the minister? Maybe.
No, I think it was just the attitude of that he had a certain status in life, and I don't mean high and low now. I mean a certain kind of position in people's lives that was unique, and I'm making more of it actually and giving it this much attention than it really.
Well, I guess I am too.
But I can think of another time actually that something like that happened, which makes more sense emotionally in some ways. My father, who was someone who had who was full of deep feeling, but never, except for angry feeling, he never really. It wasn't that obvious, but I knew that it was true. One time he was telling me as we were standing next to a car in some parking lot, I can't remember why we were, about a patient he had. He was a doctor who had told him with great difficulty about a problem in his life, which it turned out was impotence. And my father was deeply moved that the man had told him about this, which just goes to show that his relationships with his patients weren't apparently characteristically that. But I didn't know that. I found it deeply moving and very impressive, and thought to myself, I want to be someone to whom people speak that way. But I didn't know that would have to do with being a psychologist or a psychoanalyst.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
I'd
never met one. Matter of fact, I didn't know a psychoanalyst before I went to graduate school in clinical psychology. Even then I didn't, because none of my teachers were officially psychoanalysts.
So I'm guessing you did not grow up in New York.
No, I did not.
Where did you grow up?
First in rural Oregon.
Ah, uh-huh. North, south, east? I have folks in Oregon.
Yeah, Willamette Valley,
Okay.
which is western, northwestern Oregon.
Okay, wow. Way up high.
Yeah, it's very green and rainy and beautiful there.
Mm, mm.
And then when I was 11, we moved to Southern California, and that seemed to me to be an extended vacation. Oil derricks and orange groves, which seemed to me to be something you might see on Disneyland, but not real life.
But there you were.
But there it was. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. You mentioned graduate school. In the same paper we were referring to, you encountered a fork in the road when you had to choose a teacher in your first year of practica.
First week.
First week you were there. And where was there?
Michigan State.
Michigan State. Yeah, and you made a determination that turned out to be.
Yeah, my wife, because that woman who we're no longer together. I've been married to the wife that I have now for 40 almost. We've been together 45 years. So
Wow.
that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And we didn't have kids, and I do have kids, but with my current wife, and they're all grown up. So a great deal of water has flowed under the bridge since these events. But now, where was I?
We were talking about the fork in the road.
Yeah.
Yeah. In graduate school.
Yeah. Well, my ex-wife and I decided to go. We had to go to a place that would accept both of us, so we had to find a clinical psychology program that would take us both, and we wanted to go to a place that had both behavioral and psychoanalytics kind of orientations, because we didn't feel like we knew enough to make a choice beforehand. So Michigan State was I think the one place, maybe there were two or three places that accepted both of us. So we went, and that had both orientations represented in the faculty. So we went there, and there were, in the first week, the first year class, which I think there was like 18 people. It wasn't small. I don't think that's small, right? That's a good size for a graduate program.
Yeah.
We had to choose between one of two practica. Is that word familiar?
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't know if it was in general usage or not.
I think it's still. Yeah.
And one of them was run by a guy who called himself an ego psychologist, which at the time I don't think I knew what that was, but I knew that it was supposed to be psychoanalytic. But he wasn't at all. He was a social learning theorist. I don't know why he did that. And the other one was a dyed-in-the-wool Freudian drive theorist who'd neither of them had been trained analytically, but they were both, very committed to their points of view. He was a real old-fashioned, old-timey drive theorist. But he had a very interesting combination of interests, because his heroes were Freud on the one hand and Harry Stack Sullivan on the other.
There you go.
Which was a very weird thing. It still would be a weird thing, but it was unheard of.
Yeah, it's like an oxymoron.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oxymoron is what it is. It's a scholarly oxymoron. Anyway, he seemed to me to be so much more interesting than the other guy that I went with him and never looked back. I never took a behavioral course, and the whole time I was there, I didn't need to go to a place that offered both, because it only took me 5 days to make up my mind that's how that happened.
And I think I recall him really encouraging you to spend as much time as possible with patients.
Well, he encouraged me to see my patients frequently, by which he meant twice a week.
Okay.
And I found that so sort of interesting, even sometimes thrilling, because I was getting into this kind of relationship with people that I had imagined was possible. back when I was thinking about the minister and other things.
Yeah, yeah.
So I went to him and I said, I like doing this, frequently. Do you think, do people ever do it more than that? He said, go for it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was seeing people 3 and 4 times a week over the 5 years I was there, and I saw them that whole time. So by the time I was 26 years old, I basically had a handful of people in analysis for 5 years. He supervised me, and I could tell that he had certain limitations as a supervisor.
That comes through in the paper.
Yeah, and actually he and I had a real falling out at some point, which was a shame. But I always credit him with my, without him, I don't think I would have ended up doing what I did. He was very important in the course I took in life. So, yeah, that's how that happened. So I ended up, as I said in that paper, I ended up doing the things in the opposite sort of order. Most people go into treatment, and I think it makes more sense, frankly. You go into treatment, you feel how personally meaningful it is, and then you think to yourself, I think maybe I want to do that. Mm-hmm. I had people come into treatment, mm-hmm. found how meaningful that was, and then eventually thought, I think I'm going to try it myself.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that because, yes, the former, the more conventional approach to becoming an analyst is having your own training and treatment. But it does seem like you came in through it, I don't want to say backwards, but backwards is wrong. But sort of
backward, it's not altogether wrong.
Well, feeling your way through kind of the dark without a lot of tools. It sounds like this teacher didn't equip you with much other than encouragement.
Well, no, he encouraged me to think in a particular way. I learned to do uncovering work of a traditional sort. I learned through the analysis of resistance, and I learned his method, which had to do with imagery instead of association. With encouraging people to visual imagery and.
Was that early for that kind of encouragement, or no?
Well, he was the one who, as far as I know, the only one who was doing it.
Yeah. That's kind of neat, and it suits what you're talking about as the way you came into wanting to be a therapist or an analyst.
Yeah.
Feel your way in, rather than apply something layered onto. That would have come if you had done it forwards instead of backwards. So I wondered if you might be able to talk about how passion, vitality, and vulnerability, say in terms of uncertainty, can be entry points into meaning within the analytic relationship.
Well, yeah, I would say more than can be entries. That they are the entry.
Must be.
For me, certainly. I very early on, even before long before I was thinking about the possibility of theorizing such things, it seemed to me that there were two things that were essential. I came up during the time when standard psychoanalytic technique was the law of the land, so to speak, and the people I studied with did not necessarily insist that I behave that way, but it was in the air, and they knew it, and I knew it. And so I was often, judging myself by comparison to it, whether I might say, well, I don't want to be that way, or maybe I should be that way. But even though all of that was true, and even though I would have said and did in those days that despite not being a traditional Freudian anyway, I nevertheless had a Freudian superego about my clinical work, that I think we all did. I've been rid of it 20 years.
I was going to ask, so it's about You've been rid of it 20 years, and your
maybe 30.
training was when?
I trained between 76 and 80,
Okay.
my analytic training.
Okay. Yeah.
So it always seemed to me that the analytic work required two things. And the first one, whatever influence standard psychoanalytic technique had on me, I guess it was in the first one. It was other things too, but the first part of that is whatever you do has to be analytically useful or productive. But the other thing that it has to be is the second part of the statement is that you have to mean it.
Yeah.
If you don't mean what you say to people, that's really not going to make much difference to say it. It has to come from you. You have to. There's no sense in saying something to somebody unless you're saying something that you're saying to them as one person to another. Now there were I don't know that I discussed this in so many words with my supervisors. I suspect that most of them would have said okay. But I don't think it's certainly not what everybody taught me. Mm-hmm. And I remain convinced that this is true. That in fact, over the last 30, 40 years, that's what my writing's been about, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And at least in part, well, you draw meaning from your own personal past and the social contexts which were formative and meaningful.
I'm sure I do.
Yeah.
But not consciously.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that's right. But my experience of it, I suspect your experience of it, most of us would say that our experience of it is what's going on between me and the patient in the here and now, right there.
Yes.
And I'm not usually thinking about associations to my own life. I mean, sometimes I do, sure. The way Ogden thinks about getting his car out of the garage, that paper on reverie. But most of the time I don't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's only half the story, and not even half the story.
Yeah.
Because you're sitting. Yeah. Okay. Can we skip ahead to New York City and Postdoc, and how you arrived, and how you wound up at Postdoc, and
how I arrived.
what that was like, what the environment was, and
well, Postdoc came later because I trained at White, so it wasn't until after I trained, and some years after I trained, that I ended up at Postdoc. I came to New York because my ex-wife and I had enough money once we sold our car for interviews in one city, and we didn't know anybody anywhere.
Yeah. And
we didn't know any analysts who could recommend anything to us, because we didn't know any analysts either. But we sort of naively started out on this path of becoming analysts. So we decided we'd go. We found a publication of the American Psychological Association, in the back pages of which there were listings for postdoctoral psychoanalytic training programs. And the American institutes were not in there. It was just other ones. So we could have gone. We narrowed it down to San Francisco and New York because that's where the most choices were. We ended up going to New York because that's where the most choices were. Mm-hmm. And that's how we came here. It was just out of the back pages of that booklet. And the places that we applied were also from the back pages of that booklet. I don't think I'm not sure, but I don't think I applied to Postdoc. I don't remember it being one of the ones that we knew about. We didn't know about a lot. White was one of them. Mm-hmm. And for a boy from out of town, mm-hmm. who didn't know anybody and who'd never lived in a city, and so who was utterly terrified
Wow.
by arriving here, for such a boy,
Wow.
the White Institute was reassuring because it had its own building and it had a
Yeah.
staff of people there. It was a place I could imagine it would be a kind of professional home, which I needed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, I was shocked to find that the psychoanalytic heroes at this place were Freud and Sullivan.
There you go. There you go. You were home.
So that's where we went.
It sounds so serendipitous.
Well, it took a lot of effort because we arrived with absolutely no money at all. I mean, I'm not a farthing.
Wow.
And it was August, and we had enough to get through August, and that's it.
Wow.
We had rented an apartment. We had enough money. We rented a tiny little apartment on a bad part of the west side, which is now
Right.
not bad
Good
part of the
part
west
of the
side.
west
Yeah. And started our lives.
Wow. Wow.
Got a job. Got whatever jobs we could get, and managed to pay the bills.
My first analysis was with someone at White, and I met at the building. I met her. You know, our treatment was in the building. It's a lovely building, the White building.
Yeah, it's nicer now.
It's a
It's
nice
been-
one. Oh, yeah, really? It's
It's been fixed up. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it was built. I understand as an opera diva's
Really?
house at the turn of the.
Well, that staircase
Century.
lends itself to that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Let's move on to postdoc. How did that segue occur?
You know that was that's a series of funny stories. Because when I was applying to, I started teaching at ICP and Manhattan Institute and IPSS, I guess. That was a little later. It was a few years before I felt that I could apply to postdoc. And when I did, though, it was still at the very earliest days of the relational track.
Mm-hmm.
And I had coming from where I would come from, I thought of myself as a budding relational analyst, but as an interpersonalist more than anything else, I think. So I applied to the IH track, and I was invited down there to give I wrote a paper for them to give as it was part of the application
You had to do a
procedure.
writing sample. Was it your writing sample or something else?
No, it was a full scale paper.
Ah.
The old chemistry hall with there were probably 100 people
Wow.
there, and
It's a good thing I didn't have to do that.
well, I didn't really understand that it was a test. I thought they just were inviting me to do a paper, but that's what it was.
Yeah.
Then I heard nothing,
Mm.
and after a year, Ruth Lesser, who was running things then, used to live right down the street here. And I saw her on the street one day, and I said, Ruth, I had never heard anything. What happened? She said, oh, didn't somebody get in touch with you? They were supposed to. I said, no. She said, oh, well, we met, and we decided we really already have somebody who teaches what you teach. So, well, it was. I was annoyed at being treated that way, but it wasn't deeply painful. So then I applied to the relational track soon after that, and that was fun. That was easygoing and worked out. So that's how I ended up there. I could have been in either one of those tracks. I'm glad that I ended up where I did because I have so many friends in both, but they're really more focused in the relational group, I guess.
And the relational, there had just been a whole, as I understand it, some inner tension in terms of distinguishing a separate track for relational. So you arrived after that track had been.
Oh, I applied to the relational track.
Yeah.
It was already there.
Yeah.
It was there was controversy, but that had been somewhat earlier, and it was born of controversy, the relational
Yeah,
track.
that's how I understand it. It was quite a tumultuous time, as I understand.
There were a bunch of people who wanted to teach courses on object relations more than were taught and at the time at Postdoc, and the IH track didn't want them, and I don't remember whether it was they who didn't want to teach in the Freudian track or the Freudian track who didn't want them to do it, one or the other. In those days, the tracks were so much more, significant as influences.
They're quite fluid.
Yeah. So, so this group of people, I think there were 4 of them, Friedland, Mitchell, Bromberg, and I forgot who else, Gant,
Wow.
went to Bernie Kalinkowitz and said, we want to start a group, a track, so that this material can be taught. The relational perspective had just been established, and I think, Paul Stepansky at the Analytic Press started dialogues.
Oh, okay.
He saw that something was happening, and he wanted his press to be to represent the relational point of view. So he asked Steve to edit the journal that he wanted to start, and that's how that got started.
The engine got running, yeah.
And then after that, the relational track came into being, partly as a response to that. There was a growing sort of an urgency about there being a place where these ideas could be learned, and the relational track started out, I think, more than anything else, to teach, the ideas that couldn't be easily taught elsewhere, which was object relations. But then eventually, of course, it taught all of the parts of psychoanalysis that came to be known as relational, which were, at the beginning at least, less self-psychology now, but object relations, interpersonal, and self-psychology.
In the early days, what did you teach?
I think for a lot of years I taught constructivism, which was a combination of psychoanalysis and philosophy. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
There are lots of people from those days who are still around. And I learned a ton, because I had to learn a lot to do it.
Yeah.
In those days, there was a powerful philosophical sort of an interest going on at the beginning of the relational perspective, which is less evident now.
Really?
Yeah, much
feel
less.
It strongly. But now I don't have that background. Yeah.
Well, it's less necessary now, because back then, that was still the time of the. We have our own culture wars now, but that was the time of the culture wars having to do with postmodernism. And postmodernism and philosophical hermeneutics, to me, were arrayed against objectivism. And objectivism was still defended by most traditional psychoanalysts. That there is a reality in other people's heads, and it's up to the analyst to interpret it and tell them what it is, and they know. And so there was a room for a complete revision of psychoanalytic epistemology.
Yeah.
And that's what I taught.
Yeah, it sounds very exciting. A very exciting time. A lot of
Yeah.
and change, and it sounds like psychoanalytic dialogues was pivotal in the impetus to poke the fire to get relational going. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool.
I'll tell you a funny story from that time. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a story of in those days, or soon thereafter. It was really during the same time, actually. Merton Gill was one of the early analysts who had been a very traditional sort to jump ship and to change his perspective, to think differently. He didn't think differently in terms of embracing an orientation. He didn't call himself relational or interpersonal. But he was writing for many years about transference and countertransference as from a constructivist perspective, and he brought along Erwin Hoffman was Merton's protege, And in fact, Irwin used to have Merton over for dinner on Thursday nights, and they would have dinner and play with the kids, and then afterwards the two of them would go off and do their thing. And Irwin spent years working with Merton, and they wrote some things together. One time, the meetings were held in Chicago. That was the meetings of Division 39. So it was a panel that I was on that had Michael Tansey and Lou Fouché, who you might remember, might not, and Irwin, who knew all of us, because Michael and Lou were both from Chicago, where Irwin was from.
Oh, I didn't know that about Lou. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you knew Lou?
Just at the beginning of my time at NYU, he was, yes.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. I was very fond of poor
Yeah.
Lou.
Yeah.
Yeah. But a very nice guy.
Yeah.
Very sweet guy. Anyway, this was a panel on constructivism, and Irwin and Lou and Michael were giving papers, and then Irwin had wanted me to do the discussion, so I did. And after I gave the discussion, the first person who stood up to ask a question, he didn't know that I knew who he was, but of course I did. I knew him because in those days, books always had photographs of authors on their jackets. It was Merton Gill, and he had been a sort of a hero of mine for some time. But I also know that he had the reputation of taking people's heads off. So he said, Dr. Stern. And I said, yes. And he said, could you please tell us the difference between your ideas and those of Shah Khan? And I was so far from knowing those of Jacques Lacan. I had never read Lacan at that point, and few Americans had. It was probably 1981, something like that. So I said to him, well, I took my heart in my mouth. I took my heart in my hands. And I said, Dr. Gill, I said, because I know that's who you are, even though we haven't met. I don't know whether to thank you or to kill you.
You said that?
I did.
What did the audience do?
The audience just broke up.
Roared?
And thankfully he did too. And I never had to answer
I was
it.
going to say, you got off the hook with that, yeah?
It worked. It worked like a charm.
I'll remember that. That's a great story. That's a great story. It reminds me, I wanted to ask you who currently are the writers and thinkers that pique your interest now?
It's an interesting question. I mean, they fall in two groups, really. There's a group of people who I don't necessarily agree with, but who I'm very interested in. And sometimes I ask myself, but why do you maintain such an interest in these people? There's no way in the world well, I don't know why exactly. Maybe one day I'll figure that out. I'm sure they have an influence on me, but what it is exactly, I can't tell. So in that group, I would place Laplanche and people around him.
Okay.
For example, Avi Sakatopoulou from Postdoc, who was a friend, and Dominic Scarfone, whose book The Unpassed is difficult, brilliant, and wrongheaded.
Yes, we read it together.
We did, yes.
Parts of it, yes.
Yeah, I've read it with a couple of groups, and I
He's very frustrating.
he's very frustrating, but absolutely riveting, if you ask me. And others. I think the people who, though, the other group of people are writers who have an ongoing interest that feels simpatico, people with whom I feel simpatico, who have an ongoing influence on me, and that, I still have even though Ed Levinson is no longer writing and Philip is gone.
Yeah.
you know, Philip, they're both friends, and Philip was a very good friend, very close friend. And I spent a lot of years, you know, learning with and from, first from and then with Philip. And also, and Ed, I think, is right at the fulcrum of interpersonal and relational psychoanalysis. I think that the relational psychoanalysis, frankly, would be impossible without Ed. Because Ed is really the source of the idea that you can't not interact. He's the source of the, I mean, other people, Ben Wolstein said this too in 1959. He referred to the transference, countertransference interlock.
Yeah.
The way that you know, the transference unconsciously locks the countertransference into place, and vice versa. But Ben was not a very good writer. He wrote some interesting things and very innovative. But Ed was a fabulous, he's still alive, but he's not writing. So I'll use the past tense about his writing. Ed's writing is stellar. It really is. He's one of the few psychoanalysts who is funny.
Ah, yes, I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, and everybody should read Ed's work. It really is the without question the most influential body of work on me.
Okay.
And then Philip, and then I would say that in the last number of years I've taken a great deal from Thomas Ogden. I could go on, but that's a sample.
I bet you could. I've read Bromberg, of course, and I find his writing very interesting and accessible. And I'm sorry for your loss. We're very close. I never met him.
Yeah, we used to go out to dinner every month or two on the Upper East Side, because his office was up here and mine is too, and we, you know, we move around from one place to another. I think we went to almost every place on the Upper East Side over the years.
Great.
And he taught me to drink Grey Goose martinis with onions on the side, and almost no vermouth, really no vermouth at all.
Very dry.
Basically vodka.
Yeah. What impact do you feel you've had within the postdoc community? What would you like to think of as your mark on the program and your influence?
Well, that's oddly enough, it's a question that's never occurred to me. What influence have I had? I mean, I probably would have an easier time answering the other way around. What influence has Postdoc had on me? But
we could do that. That sounds intriguing too.
Well, I don't know exactly what I would say there either, but I could. It just feels a little easier. What influence have I had on Postdoc? Okay, I hadn't thought about this, but I think maybe I've contributed to the what should I call it? I would like to think that I've contributed to the intellectual and scholarly acceptability of interpersonal psychoanalysis. You know, it was never a fair thing that interpersonal psychoanalysis was dealt with as if it were not quite, you know, of the same depth as other kinds of psychoanalysis. I would like to think, and I kind of think is true, that I've had that what I've done has been an influence in the other direction, and I think that influence deserves to be wielded. You know, and not necessarily by me, but I mean deserves to exist. There is something about the interpersonal point of view, and to me that's the most important part of the relational point of view, but which also is heavily influenced by object relations, of course. I think that what's not appreciated about interpersonal psychoanalysis, and maybe where I've made a difference, is at Postdoc in particular, because at White, my other location, there isn't a difference of everybody sort of. They say that when you start talking about differences, they say, "Oh, well, it's interesting, but it doesn't matter."
Not us, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter so much, but it matters more in Postdoc.
Yeah.
I think that there is a lack of recognition that what we could call structural aspects of mind are embodied in multiple self theory. That is missed, I think, by a lot of people in psychoanalysis who think who think of interpersonal psychoanalysis as more sociological or environmental.
Yeah.
And miss the fact that the way that self states go in and out of awareness and bring with them both threats and the actualization of potential plays the same role in that theory that unconscious structure and unconscious fantasy play in conventional psychoanalysis, other kinds of psychoanalysis.
Okay.
I won't get into that in a lot of detail here, but I hope that I've contributed to that, to that recognition.
So that differentiation, that misconception that you're identifying, do you think it's as prevalent now, given your impact, certainly your work, and others? You think it's still a misconception about?
I think that there's been a general relaxation in the relationships between different psychoanalytic schools, but has there been a basic difference in the evaluation of each by the other? I don't know so much.
Okay, and it's hard. I'm in the forest at Postdoc, so it's hard for me to know what else is out there. Well, certainly, given your body of work, you certainly have more publications than there are cardinals in Rome right now.
I don't know what that adds up to.
It's over 130.
Oh, I don't mean the number. I mean the significance. But
like you say, there's more conversation among tracks and
much more.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's true all over the field, but certainly it's true all over the field. But it's certainly true at Postdoc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the huge advantages of Postdoc, in terms of being able to be exposed and to sample and to try different forms, different tracks.
Yeah.
So actually, that's what I want to ask you. How do you see the direction of psychoanalysis evolving here and abroad, and is it a direction that excites or concerns you?
Well, that's a big question. Though I'll take the last part first, which is that it excites.
That's the more juicy part. Yeah.
Well, no, they both are juicy. But I think that the future both excites and concerns me. I mean, it's hard to imagine anyone saying anything else. I worry about whether what's distinctively psychoanalytic will remain, uppermost in our minds. I think. What encourages me is that the number of young or younger, because we're an old field, but the number of younger people entering the field is astonishing to me. I would have thought, because it's much better. The numbers are much better than they were 15, 20 years ago from my seat, from where I sit. One of the reasons for that is the opening up of psychoanalysis to non-mental health practitioners, which I have to admit, I was initially skeptical about. I thought, well, how are these people going to deal with psychopathology, for example? I mean, because they're going to come from, directing movies or being a lawyer to doing this. They're not going to have any experience. But what I have found is quite has reassured me completely. The people who are going into the field, now this is less true actually at Postdoc, because Postdoc is restricted to taking only certain people, certain backgrounds. So for our purposes, maybe it's not as relevant. I wasn't thinking about that. But it is one of the things that makes me hopeful. That some of the best people I know going into the field are people who are licensed qualifying professionals.
Yes.
People who are going into the field from other fields for all the right reasons, not the ones I went in. Most of the time they were in treatment, and it started a fire in them, and they wanted to change fields. So I'm encouraged in that way. In terms of how did you put the first part of the question again?
How do you see the direction of psychoanalysis evolving?
What I'd like to see, let me answer it that way, is a more and more serious acceptance of a comparative perspective. It always has made sense to me that respectful coexistence among different orientations in psychoanalysis is the way to go. That we have so much more in common with one another, even analysts who are far apart on our own little, theoretical matrices. What's one line called? Continua. Even those who are very different, Laplanchian, for example, have so much more in common with one another than they do with anybody else. If we're going to last, I think we have to recognize develop a sense of community that involves all of us. Recognize that we have something very important at the core in common. To me, synthesis of different points of view is really not where I want to see our effort go. I want to see our effort go into sharpening the differences between them so that they really are clear why they're different, and to do that with mutual respect, so that we can talk to one another about what we think without having to talk to one another about why the other person is wrong. Developing a sense of how a reasonable person could see things so differently from the way that I do makes that excites me. I really get into that. That's where the groups came from.
Yeah.
They were study groups, like ours.
Yeah.
That's where they come from, because I want to learn about other points of view, and my own, but I want to learn about other points of view in a way that is not simply a prelude to rejecting them, but is a prelude to entering them and getting deeply involved, so deeply enough involved that I can answer that question. How could a reasonable person feel this differently than I do about something?
But have enough affect regulation and tolerance and openness to be able to discuss that.
Well, I guess it probably takes some of that, yeah.
Yeah. Is that happening anywhere? Is there movement towards that? Do you foresee that as being...
Yeah, I think, it may have been forced on the American Psychoanalytic Association that membership had to become more open to people who didn't come from institutes of the old American. It had to be forced on them, basically by their aging out. They got so old that they had to have the membership of the younger institutes.
Okay.
I think that's largely why they opened up so much. There were people who had ideals as well. But what's happened since now this organization is so much more commodious. It's a bigger tent.
Yeah.
What's happening is that there's more willingness to listen to what other people have to say, I think, than there was in the past by a long shot. When I was in training, my teachers didn't even bother submitting papers to any of the the higher status journals because they wouldn't even read them.
Huh.
Because if they were identifiably interpersonal or relational. The relational group ended up, really making a difference in that, because for whatever reason, the relational group is much more successful
Yeah.
in attracting the interest and the respect of the rest of the field than the interpersonalists were.
Outside the realm of your analytic thinking, your practice, your writing, what would I find you doing? What floats your boat?
I spend a lot of time on stuff in the field.
I bet you do.
At the moment I'm teaching five classes, and I've got 40 odd hours of patients, and then I'm presenting usually every weekend.
Yeah.
And so there's not a lot of time left, but this has really gotten jammed up. It wasn't always quite this busy. The reason I'm teaching so many classes is that I have three private groups,
Yeah.
which aren't reading the same thing.
Yeah.
So I have to prepare separately, for them. And then I happen to be finishing both courses at White and Postdoc at the moment. And once they're finished, things will settle down a little bit. But what you'd find me doing is I love movies and I love fiction. I'm always reading something.
What kind of fiction?
Novels. Good novels. I don't like. I mean, I like some thrillers if they're well done, but not really. That's not where I'm reading sort of in the same land, I guess, that I work in a way. The deeply felt stories of that leave me with a perspective I didn't have before. I also came up with an interest in fantasy. Now I mean fantasy literature, not fantasy in psychoanalytic terms. So sometimes I'm reading some sort of a novel in that direction. Reading one at the moment.
I'm glad you take the time to go there too. Yeah, nice.
And more than any other thing, actually, is grandkids.
Yes, I was going to say, sometimes during our study group, there's the padding of several footsteps. I think 8. Are there 8 footsteps that I hear sometimes? Is that right?
Well, I wasn't aware that you'd heard them, but I guess they must have been here. They must have been here, but yeah, I have.
Yes.
I have 4 grandsons.
Yes.
Little ones.
Yes. Below what age?
9 on down.
Oh, fun. Yes, every once in a while you go, can you hear that in the background? Anyway, well, I guess we're out of time. Thank you, Donald, very much.
Thank you for doing this on a
Absolutely.
weekend morning too. That goes for both of you.